This week on To the Contrary.
First, why mass shootings may be a man's issue. Behind the headlines, Arianna Huffington, creator of Huffington Post, promotes the value of rest and recovery, and remembering Dr. Maya Angelou.
Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, changing our culture to prevent mass shootings.
Are mass shootings an epidemic of violence against women? The killing spree last week in California by a 22-year-old student whose name we won't mention and face we won't show has sparked a flurry of online debate over the daily sexist treatment of women. Why are we not showing his identity? It's our way of helping to prevent copycat acts. The killer wrote the following: "My hatred and rage toward all women festered inside me like a plague. Women deemed me unworthy of having them, and so they deprived me of an enjoyable youth while giving their love and sex to other boys." End quote. Many men responded online with the hashtag #NotAllMen. The term was invented to defend nonviolent men, which is, of course, most men. Frustration with the hashtag and an apparent failure to acknowledge the role that misogyny played in the recent shootings led to another social media campaign, #YesAllWomen. That term was created to shift focus away from what men don't do to what women must fear on a daily basis. Author, filmmaker, and public speaker Jackson Katz says male-on-female violence is gendered violence and should be discussed publicly in much greater detail.
In almost every case, the conversation talks about, in terms of motive for the shooter, in terms of explanatory factors, it talks about gun availability and mental illness. So I think a national conversation, a much more honest national conversation about cultural narratives about manhood, how we socialize boys, what is the relationship between violence and masculinity, especially, by the way, violence to reclaim something that has been taken from him. Because in the vast majority of school shootings and rampage killings, men are responding to either having been bullied, feelings of loss or grief or anxiety about not measuring up as men, and they use violence as a means of changing the narrative that places them back at the center of the narrative as manly men who are taking back control of their lives. Unless we have a conversation about these cultural narratives that are pervasive, we're just going to have shooting after shooting in a culture that is awash in guns and men who are insecure and feeling powerlessness and angry.
And how can women play a role in moving the conversation forward?
It's been women who have been talking about and leading the discussion about cultural ideologies of manhood. It's been men who have been, generally speaking, resistant to that conversation. But we need more men to join them and to have the integrity and the honesty and the self-confidence to say, you know what? I, as a man, play a role in this culture, and I'm going to have to be honest and self-critical and figure out how I can play a more constructive role in addressing these issues, because the conversation up till now hasn't gotten us very far. We haven't really figured out much, and the missing piece, like I said, it's not the only thing that we need to do, but the missing piece has been a much more active engagement on the part of men.
So, Donna Brazile, and welcome back to the show. We missed you. Will, talking about mass killings in terms of men, not only men, but really white men, he talks about that, although not in the clips that we used. Should that be part of the conversation? Will it help or hurt?
I think so, because 98% of mass shooters are white male. And we often talk about them as individuals in an isolated case and perhaps whatever mental state he might have been in, and we don't look at the whole bigger picture. And I think it's time that we talk about sexual rejection that often lead men to want to go after the person, the violence, and it's often directed at women.
I think this is an interesting sort of line of inquiry, but I think we have to be very, very careful not to extrapolate too much from any of these horrifying incidents to the larger society. I hate to think that we've created a culture where we're pitting men against women.
But I would say that stereotypes box everybody in. So whether you are a man or a woman or a minority of any sort, one of the things that you end up seeing is that stereotypes do limit your choices. And when people sort of feel boxed in by them, one of the things that happens is, rage against sort of the machine, so to speak.
Well, even more so than gender, I hope that this again starts a conversation on bullying in schools, because it does seem like one of the common factors is that they were bullied. Not just rejected by women or rejected by people, their peers, they were bullied in schools. And I think that's a really important discussion to be having.
I think I want to get back to Jackson Katz. I think he's obviously a formidable figure in bringing men into the sexism conversation, and I think personally believe that the final chapter in feminism is getting men involved and getting men doing half the house care, working with their women, seeing their own women as equal, and that's what's going to lead eventually to social justice and gender justice in this country. But don't we also, Donna, risk, if we start lashing out at white men for being responsible for these killings, that's got to be, that's got to have terrible consequences.
Look,
one would think.
33 people die every day in this country. We see incidents of black on black.
By gun, you mean?
By gun violence, black on black crimes in some urban communities that are at record proportions. But I think if we don't talk about some of these larger societal issues, we will not get to the heart of what's happening in our culture right now. People feeling isolated, alienated, not feeling that they belong, being bullied. If we don't try to address some of these systemic factors, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of what's causing our kids and others to go out there and seek revenge because they feel that they've been targeted by someone.
But of course, one of the things that you're sort of referencing, and I think this is important to have men part of the conversation, but I think one of the things that has driven men to maybe not feel part of the conversation is modern feminism, right? We've created a world in which we expect women and men to be the same. And in some regards, I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that's the reason for any of this, of course not, but we've complicated gender relationships. We've complicated what it means to be a woman versus a man, and I think that may require a deeper conversation.
But, I also think that when you look at what at least Jackson Katz is talking about, he's talking about having an understanding of masculinity that is not sort of limited to our current sort of images of it, which is either sort of vigilante justice as being a notion of courage or sort of adolescent incompetence, where a man can't find the cold medicine and he's sort of, shamed by the woman in the commercial.
Right.
I mean, it is stunning to me, the cultural presentations of both men and women, and I do think as women we've done an amazing job to sort of discuss how we're portrayed. And I do think men, to a certain degree, have ignored it or left it out of the conversation.
Well, you can say that, and you can certainly say that on a mass scale, but I can't think of his last name right now, but there was John with the men's movement out in California 20 years ago who had Robert Bly. Robert Bly, exactly. Sorry about that. And let's go out and camp together and do campfires and bang on bongo drums or whatever they were doing out in the woods. And there have been more recently things like Men Can Stop Rape, which we portrayed 20 years ago on this show, now is a national, then local organization, now national, getting men together. I mean, you can't say that there's been no conversation about men during this last wave of feminism, which has certainly focused more on women, but not left men out.
Well, and it's nice to see that the White House has been taking the lead on that. You mentioned rape specifically. The White House recently had several events where Vice President Joe Biden spoke out about that. But an interesting thing I'd like to note is he led off that conversation by saying, where I come from, if you touched a woman, we'd beat the crud out of you. And so even then, you have the White House coming out there and using violence as the answer to something terrible happening. So even the White House maybe needs to take a look at how they're portraying men in society and how to react to these sorts of situations.
Well, campus sexual assault is really at an epidemic proportion, and I can tell you.
And the cover of Time magazine a couple of weeks ago was, rape on a what looked like a college sports emblem.
Yeah, but misogyny kills, and that's a conversation that, again, people are not comfortable with these topics, and unless we can allow both men and women to have a dialogue and communicate about these issues, then we're once again just waiting for the next quote-unquote rampage or next mass shooting, and then we'll go back to the usual conversation.
But let
That's
me
not
just,
good enough.
I really do think that we need to be careful not to extrapolate too much from an incident like this. This whole campaign, this social movement, Yes All Women, I actually found this rather repulsive. The idea was that we were trying to promote this idea that discrimination is rampant, that violence against women is rampant, that America is inherently unfair and sexist towards women, that going out for a jog or going on your college campus is inherently dangerous. This is a very disturbing narrative that we should be cautious to be reining in, and I think we need to, if we want to have an honest conversation, then we need to sort of ratchet back some of this rhetoric.
It paints women as a victim.
Constantly.
As well.
How will that help? Ratchet back how?
Exactly. Well, I think that's the big thing. Do we want to help women make better choices? Do we want to make sure that men are making better choices? Let's have a real conversation and not make this just about a social movement.
What do you give me more?
Well, look, if we want to talk about women,
and
and violence on campuses, I think that these numbers have been grossly overstated to start with. But what's more important is how do we make sure that women are safe on campuses? Are they making good choices for themselves? That's not to excuse any kind of assault that is someone does to a woman, but are they making good choices? Are they drinking too much? Are they putting themselves into situations that they maybe shouldn't be putting themselves? Those are things that women have control over, and that's something that we should feel empowered by.
But I think you raised this issue of power. And I think at the end of the day, this ends up becoming about power. The violence against women is about power. And I think, one of the things that you can see is that young women often don't feel empowered. So it is not surprising to me that then in social situations, there's not always, if you will, a good choice to make. But the idea that that woman is then at fault is hugely problematic and not appropriate.
Well, but let's get back to, I want to try to figure out a solution, not that, we're going to do it today, but how do you get to men like this guy? Is it even possible to get to any of these shooters beforehand, to talk to them more about their problems, I guess, as men, as Jackson Katz would have us do? Would that help? Would that prevent these kinds of situations?
Well,
or is it, given the availability of guns and the prevalence, quite frankly, of mental illness that turns into violence, because there's also much more mental illness that doesn't become violence, but the ability of mentally ill people to act on violent urges seems to be great, and harm other people in the process, seems to be greater than at any time in our history.
Well, and most, it is important to say that most people who are harmed in this society are mentally ill, and they are the ones who are often preyed upon and hurt. So we have to understand that as well. No, I hope that we can have a broader conversation where it's not just women talking about, here are all the steps we need to take. Men need to be engaged in this conversation, and it's important that men begin to talk about what it means to be a man. And you don't have to be tough and, carry around a big stick and be violent to be, a man in society. I remember when I had, 8 brothers and sisters, and my parents, my mother and father, not only did they treat us all the same, but they gave us all the same advice in terms of when we went out and how we conducted ourselves in the public and in private as well. And we don't have those conversations anymore. We sweep everything under the rug, and then we suspect that one day if somebody does something bad, well, it's just that individual. No, we are no longer teaching our kids how to be good people.
All right, we are out of time on this one. Thank you. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay or at To The Contrary. Behind the headlines, Arianna Huffington built a media empire, but she says if she hadn't stressed so much, she could have done better. In her new book, Thrive, she suggests we examine how we define success.
Arianna Huffington says her epiphany was a rude awakening, literally.
7 years ago, I collapsed from burnout, sleep deprivation, exhaustion. On the way down, I hit my head on my desk, broke my cheekbone, got 4 stitches on my right eye, and it started me, as I came to in my own pool of blood, to ask, these questions that we stop asking after we leave college, unfortunately, like what is a good life, what is success?
Her book, Thrive, attempts to answer these questions. The founder of the Huffington Post examined how society defines success.
It really is just two metrics that we define success by, money and power. And this is like trying to sit on a two-legged stool. Sooner or later you fall off. And that's why I came up with this third metric of success that includes well-being, wisdom, wonder, and giving.
Now the Huffington Post dedicates a large section to the third metric. But it's not just the site that changed. The headquarters have, too.
We moved to new offices, and we have dedicated nap rooms, yoga rooms, meditation rooms. In New York, we have 2 dedicated nap rooms, meditation, yoga, and breathing classes, healthy snacks everywhere, and an email policy which makes it clear that when you're off work, you're not expected to be on email.
Yet she says this added rest won't result in reduced productivity.
I'm not advocating at any point in the book not working hard or not having big dreams or not accomplishing. I'm just saying there is another way, there is another path forward, and it is a much wiser way.
In fact, she insists leaders will do a better job if they are less tired.
President Clinton himself says, the most important mistakes I made when I was tired. Steve Jobs said his best ideas came after Zen meditation. Bill Gates, who famously took think weeks away from everything and all his devices out in a cabin. And so one of the steps I recommend is learning to disconnect from our technology, not charging our smartphones by our bed, for example, and then being tempted to look at our data when we wake up.
Huffington cites research supporting the need for personal renewal, but she also uses her own experiences to make her point.
I know for myself I've been much more effective, and I know for sure that I would have achieved everything I achieved with less worry, less anxiety, less damage to my health and my relationships. The biggest growth of the Huffington Post has happened over the last 7 years, when I have been actually getting more sleep and meditating and doing all the things I practice.
This advice could even be more important for women.
Women internalize stress differently, according to the data, and as a result, we pay a higher price for stress. Women in stressful jobs have a 40% greater risk of heart disease and a 60% greater risk of diabetes.
In her book, she outlines steps one can take to thrive, but she says it's difficult to do so because we are addicted to our old ways.
I'm by no means doing this perfectly, but when we become aware of how we're feeling and how we're doing, then it's much easier to course correct. What we need is more role models who do success differently, so that we don't remain under the collective delusion that the only way to be a leader and to be successful is to burn out.
So your thoughts about this, Francesca, about Arianna, who, by the way, back before she founded Huffington Post, was a regular on this program.
You know, she makes some really good points in the book that even if you don't have a lot of free time, you work at a job that's 24/7, just taking a couple minutes every couple hours and just centering yourself and focusing and just taking a couple minutes of me time will make you a much more productive person. And I've been reading the book, and I have to tell you, I've been taking her advice, and I think I've been a lot more productive and doing a lot better at my job.
Well, I've been taking my own advice for a long time, which is essentially, I just cut it off. I call it a Donna Day, because I used to have a Donna Day, a DOD, and I learned the only way to get over it was to have a Donna Day, and that's a day where I am totally at peace with myself. None of my gadgets are on. I put on nice music, and I go out in my garden, and I just let it all just melt away.
Yeah, but let me ask you, were you able to do that during when you managed a presidential campaign?
No. In fact, let me just say, one of the hardships of my life is that every 2 years of my life since my teens, I took off my life to work for someone else, and I devoted my entire life life to, those individuals or those campaigns. And that's why, as I've gotten older, I recognize that I have to restore my own soul before I can go out there and save other souls.
That's great. No, actually, this brought me back to my first boss here in Washington, Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick. And she said to me, Sabrina, you can do anything you want, just not all at the same time. And I think it's those very simple maxims that we sometimes forget, and we have to go back and say, hey, we can do lots of different things. I would love to be volunteering at a hospital right now and doing more for my community and charity, but I have 3 little kids. I'm involved with their school. I have a job. It's hard to do as much as we all want to do all at the same time.
And let me just bring in, something that I heard from a theologian, which I thought was really fascinating. And it was that Sunday is considered a day of rest, not just because we are supposed to rest and unwind or commit ourselves to God, but it is actually a day of rest because it's supposed to remind us with a sense of humility that the world moves on without us. And I think part of needing to sort of get away from our gadgets and get away from our technology is really about reminding ourselves that we are not as important as we like to constantly believe we are.
Well, and quite frankly, that's why I enjoy foreign travel, because if you ever want to make yourself feel like you do not matter in this world, you go to India, you go to Calcutta or one of the cities with a whole lot of poverty, and you see how bad that poverty is and how little you can help. That there are forces grander than yourself are going to have to solve this problem. If that doesn't put anybody in their place, I don't know what does.
Well, when you talk about poverty, I grew up in poverty, and it's going back to my neighborhood. But when I go back, I get this sense that there's more to be done, and we want to all pay it forward. And that's another point I think that Arianna tries to make in her book, and that we all want to try to leave the world a much better place. But we have to start with ourselves.
Something that really hit home for me in the book on that subject was she said, in your obituary, what do you want to be remembered for? Do you want to seriously have in your obituary, she had 600 friends on Facebook, and she answered her emails in a timely manner, and that really, really hit home for me as a working woman who works in media and politics, is that we spend so much time worrying about things like that and not enough time worrying about other people, our children, charity, poverty.
And part of the problem, I think, has been the conversation about women and work has really centered on women making it to the C-suite, women becoming the neurosurgeon, not women creating some kind of tapestry of work and life and home that suits them and their needs. And I think when we do that and we think about what do we want when I'm 90 years old, what am I going to care about, it puts a lot of that into perspective.
All right, and to put it more into perspective, at this point, we'd like to celebrate the life of a majestic woman we lost this week. Poet and activist Dr. Maya Angelou died after a lifetime of creative achievement and advancement for African American and all women. In 2010, she talked to us about remembering the civil rights leaders who came before her. Today, we remember her contributions.
We need more women in every area of American life. But we have to confess and admit that we are doing better than we did. You see, otherwise, young people will say, well, you mean to say you've been working this long and nothing has happened? And then they give up. I think it's dangerous to not recognize progress. It's dangerous. It says to those who went before us, who paid for us already, we're saying, in effect, it doesn't matter. Your contributions are not sufficient. No, I think every age has its own charge to keep.
You knew her well, Donna. What are your thoughts? How should she be remembered as far as you're concerned?
As a phenomenal woman, a woman who once said that we all have untold stories that should be told. A woman who empowered others to act and to be themselves. She was a remarkable woman, and I know there's a wonderful place wherever she is right now where she is just doing storytelling and reunited with Martin Luther King and Coretta and Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Dorothy Height, James Baldwin. I can just imagine the stories that they're now talking because Maya is up there just making them all laugh.
And the ability, I think, that she had to make a living doing everything that people love to do, dancing, singing, acting, writing, teaching. I mean, she was able to do that and not just make a living, but make such a humongous impact. I mean, are there any lessons there for people coming up now?
You know, she didn't care about people's titles or, you know, their wealth. What she enjoyed was bringing out that gift that they had, that joy. And that made her happy, just seeing other people laugh. I think if she was still here today talking to us in that remarkable Southern sassy voice of hers, she would just say, go on and just be who you are. And then I'll just applaud you.
All right, and we applaud you too. Thank you for the recollections. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week. I mean, that to me is amazing. How many